I believe that everyone has that one superhero that accompanies them throughout their entire lives. For me, as well as probably most of you, it was Spider-Man.
I want Spider-Man!
I was born in 2004, so I grew up with the Sam Raimi trilogy. I watched Spider-Man 2 like hundreds of times, and I was scared to shit of Venom. Which, looking back, is kinda goofy. Yeah, 4-year-old me shit his pants. Probably. Anyways, the Spectacular Spider-Man is my favorite iteration of the character, and funny enough, Spider-Man is the entire reason this YouTube channel exists. You see, back then when I was a little child, the stores, called Real as well as Müller, that were near me, didn't really have great Spider-Man toys. I was annoyed as fuck that these Hasbro things don't have good articulation. I mean, why would you sell Spider-Man figures that can only lift one arm? What the fuck? Little me was so annoyed that he definitely thought, fine.
I'll do it myself.
So naturally, as any 5-year-old kid would do, I took some straws, as well as some toothpicks, and combined them, and made my very first Spider-Man figure. That kinda escalated, didn't it? It's kinda funny that I've done all this shit just because I was annoyed that the toys kinda sucked. And it's even more funny that now I'm making sculptures that don't move at all. Yeah, little me would be proud. Now, 16 years later and paired with the release date of Spider-Man Brand New Day, what better time than now to make a proper Spider-Man figure to kinda honor my childhood self. And also, well, it's Spider-Man, isn't it? To start the figure off, as always, I had to make a base. I didn't have much time, so I needed to figure out a base that would fit the idea for the Spider-Man figure that I had in mind. At first I wanted to include small references to the movie, as I usually do, but that turned out to be rather difficult. At the time that I was sculpting this, not much was known about the main villain, which was kinda bad because usually I would have added them onto the base. I did, however, want to include a part of these red brick buildings that you see a lot of in these trailers. This movie finally gives New York a characterization compared to the other movies, and I wanted to include this in my base. And as you can see, I made these corner walls using cardboard as a base, which I then covered with clay. I stuck some toothpicks on the top of it to kind of represent the steel rods that are inside buildings, which I then followed up by using a rock to make the texture. Now, as I've said before, these are brick buildings, so I needed to add these lines, which I did by pressing in a ruler and, well, adding more vertical lines. With the wall ready, I drilled some holes into the base and secured it in place. Moving on, I then intended to make a pillar, or at least a somewhat broken pillar. I intend this to be the part where the Spider-Man figure is going to be set in place, and I don't want the Spider-Man figure to fall, so it has to be rather stable. To make the column, I therefore used a wooden dowel and covered it with cardboard as well as clay to get the rectangular shape right. On one end of the wooden dowel I drilled in 4 holes and glued in some metal wires, which I then would be able to secure onto the base. I left some room in the middle of the wooden dowel, which I then covered with clay and used a rock to add some texture. Once the first layer of clay was applied, I glued 4 wooden skewers onto the edges of the clay and then covered them up again with some clay. Only this time only at the top and the bottom, leaving the middle area free. This is supposed to represent a broken pillar, because someone destroyed it. Once the corners were perfectly edgy, I went ahead and used again the same rock and added again some texture. I also used other rocks to add even more battle damage to this pillar. After the pillar was basically done, I added 4 pieces of metal wire on top of it to make it appear as if the metal rods that are inside the pillar are sticking out, because, well, it's broken. Now, in the trailers there was one villain that kinda stood out to me, because we haven't seen him properly in live action yet, and that is Scorpion. In my head, he is the reason why the pieces that are on the base are broken. So I kinda took inspiration from the Hot Toys Deluxe Edition, and kinda intended to add him onto the base. Making this tail wasn't easy because I didn't really have any reference pictures, so I kinda freestyled it. Starting off, I used a iron wire for the middle and 3 on the side, which I then joined together by drilling 3 holes into a piece of cardboard. Now, as I've stated before, I didn't really have much time to make this sculpture, so naturally I decided to give Scorpion's pointy tail some movability. Because that's just the normal thing to do when you have barely no time left. I mean, who needs sleep anyways? Now, since I didn't have many reference pictures, I drew it on a piece of paper and made some paper hinges using super glue and paper, which together kinda becomes like plastic. Once the individual pieces were cut out, I glued them together using some more super glue and drilled a hole onto the sides. The hinges were then connected using either a metal wire or some toothpicks, which I then glued onto the sides to still have the movability. Easy as that, no 3D printer needed. Anyways, with the hinges done, I started to add clay to make the armor of the scorpion tail. With the armored parts of the hinges done, I went ahead and glued it onto the wires. Now, usually Scorpion's tail consists of 3 main wires, but I had to cut the lowest one to be properly able to glue on the hinges. The reason for that is that in that area there are 3 thinner wires that are then glued. In the screenshots that I have from the trailers, they appear to be sort of like cables or something, so I recreated them. I then covered every piece of cardboard with some clay to be able to have a base for the armored pieces. Before I sculpt the armor, however, I still had to add some details onto the tip. I'm gonna put a picture in the corner of this video so you can kind of see of what exactly I'm sculpting, because it's quite hard to explain what exactly I'm doing here, but I think you'll understand. Throughout this video you are going to see me use a white piece of cloth that is a stretchy band that has some texture on it to add texture onto the clay, which I do by just pressing it onto that. Sort of like a stamper. As you can see, on top of the tail there are also some more wires, which I then added more detail to. Also, when pressing in the wires, be careful not to poke yourself, which definitely didn't happen to me. With these tiny details finished, I also continued by adding the first piece of armor. Like I said, freestyle. And again, using the piece of cloth to add some texture. I had some leftover green stuff that I glued around the wires as a lazy way to reproduce this detail of the tail. I also glued in some toothpicks to kind of mimic the screws that are visible on the sides. Moving on, it was now finally time to sculpt the armored pieces of the tail. There isn't much to say here because they basically stretch throughout the entire tail, but there is a thicker part, or better said a larger part, and a thinner part. I've completed the tip of the tail and thus start with the larger part of the armor, which is then followed by the smaller part of the armor. Both of these pieces alternate until the entire tail is covered. In between these sections, I again used the green stuff that I had left over, which I wrapped around the wires. Again, I didn't really have many reference pictures for this, so most of that is just estimating what the shape of the tail would be, and the rest is just straight up freestyle. I have no clue what I'm doing here, but no one notices, so who gives a shit? Fake it till you make it, bitch. Kinda looks scorpion-y, so I guess that's good enough. Setting the scorpion tail aside, I also wanted to include 2 steel beams onto the base. Pretty simple, since technically it's an H shape. I rolled out 3 pieces of clay which I glued on top of each other, the middle one being baked first for stability, and that's basically it. Now, depending on how you want the steel beams to be, you can either make them straight, or as I did, a bit bent, which sort of is supposed to represent that it's broken. Now, to add some rubble, I rolled out a piece of clay, baked it, and then destroyed it. Like I said before, I didn't have much time to make the sculpture, so I found a lazy way to make the rubble. Since I'm breaking the clay apart, I don't really have control as to how they break, which adds to the randomness of the broken pieces. And yeah, that's the base basically finished. And we can now finally move on to make Spider-Man. Now, before that, there are 2 ways to make a Spider-Man figure. The first one is to just have him stand there and kind of hit a Spider-Man pose, which, well, that's just fucking boring, innit? That's kind of what I did with Spider-Man 2099 because I couldn't figure out how to make him swing, and it looks good, but it doesn't scream Spider-Man for me. And since this is the first Spider-Man figure I've made in like 10 years' time, I wanted to include some webs and have him appear to be swinging, or kind of in the air. The only way to do that is to balance the figure on one leg and position him a bit higher on the base. That's basically the reason why I made the pillar. To start the sculpt, I first needed to make the wire skeleton. For the torso, I'm using an aluminum wire, and for the legs, I'm using an iron wire. This will ensure that I can keep the figure on one leg. I then glued the wires together, covered them with aluminum foil, and bent them into the pose that I needed. As I've stated before, I wanted to make a dynamic Spider-Man figure that appears to be in the air, so that's what I did. If you're wondering how exactly I'm hitting those poses and getting them right every time, I have a Lego mannequin that I made myself using some parts and cutting some other parts. I know, it's a sin, but it helps. I want Spider-Man to shoot some webs, so I'm adding 3 thin wires to the forearm of the right hand to make the web shooting gesture. Usually I do the hand separated, but I thought this time this could be easier, and also it saves me a lot of time. That said, it was now time to add the clay. I'm trying to cover the entire body with clay and at the same time get the basic form of the muscles right. In this movie, Spider-Man is wearing a suit that is kind of compressing his muscles, which means that I don't have to be as detailed as I usually am with anatomy. I do, however, still want it to be able to be seen that he has muscles, which is why I'm making them slightly visible throughout this entire project. To start that off, I'm first adding the details of the knees. And as I've said before, I'm only adding the slight outlines of the muscles. With the legs basically finished, I can finally add the muscles on the arms. Now, as I usually do, I try to add the basic shape of the clay that mimics the muscles and then blend them smooth to give them the proper shape. The thing that I personally like a lot in this suit is that it's finally embracing the wrinkles, so I definitely had to add them as well. To make these, I added very thin clay noodles to add to the areas that I thought would have wrinkles. Now, the suit is still skin tight, so most of these areas are the joints. With the legs finished, I started to work on the torso. As I've said before, I still want some muscles to be visible, in a way necessary, but at the same time barely visible, especially because most of it will be covered by the webs later on, which at the time I didn't know. Still worth it though. If you're having problems as to deciding which muscles you should sculpt, the most important ones would definitely be the chest, the shoulders, the biceps, triceps, the thigh muscles, as well as the lats on the back, which you can basically see me sculpting here. I know there are more, I am no anatomy expert, maybe I'll make a video about it one day, but I do think that there are better tutorials on YouTube, because I am not an expert. With the anatomy of the body basically finished, it was now time to make the head. To quote a friend of mine, it's a good thing that I don't need to make a face, because this is just the basic head shape that I would usually do without a nose. Having made the basic head shape, I then had to make the eyes. To make those, I added a thin piece of clay onto the eye areas that sort of resemble the Spider-Man eyes, and then cut them into the shape that I needed. I did the same thing for the white area of the eyes, since I wanted the black parts to be a bit elevated. After the head was baked, it was just a matter of adding it onto the body, which I connected by adding clay to the neck area and blending the seams together. Since I still needed to make the hands, I added clay sausages to the individual fingers of the web shooting gesture and blended them smooth. Don't mind the green stuff, I just added that for stabilization, and overall I added more clay onto the hand to make the proper hand shape. Then I added another piece of clay onto the middle area of the hands to complete the web shooting gesture. The only thing missing was add a line in between this piece of clay to separate the individual fingers. As for the other hand, I just had to make a fist because this one is gonna grab some webs. First I added some clay for the palm, then the fingers as well as the thumb, and just like with the piece of clay on the web shooting gesture, separated each finger. And to finish the torso, I added some more clay noodles to make the wrinkles that are still missing. And I almost forgot, this suit has some seam lines on the blue areas, which I just carved into the clay. It is now time to make the webs. Now, I'm not the only guy on YouTube that has made a Spider-Man figure out of clay. Of course, there are also Spider-Man figures that you can buy online. Most of these figures have one thing in common with the webs. Either they are drawn onto or carved into. And personally, I don't think this would look good on this figure. I mean, sure, it's a nice solution, a lazy solution, and it does look good, especially because, well, the webs are kinda thin. But as you guys know me, I'm not happy with just doing things the normal way.
If I could kill it, I would.
Since I'm working with clay, the first solution to make raised 3D webs would be to make the webs out of clay. The problem that I had with that is that thin clay is disgusting to work with. The same thing goes for clay glue, it just didn't look the way I wanted it to. The other solution that I had in mind was using wires, but fuck no, that shit does not stick to clay. The other thing is that I didn't want it to appear like the Sam Raimi suit. If the webs are too thick, that might be the case, and I don't want to take that risk. The third solution that I thought would be the final one was to use green stuff and roll it really thin. Now, as you guys can guess, this didn't work and is also the reason why at the beginning of the video for the scorpion tail, I had that much excess green stuff. The reason why the green stuff didn't work is that it was very uneven and very hard to make the webs. Besides the wire, I also thought that I could maybe use some sewing strings, but same as with the wire, it didn't stick. So there was only one thing left that I could still do. Paper. You see, if you cut paper very thin, it sort of becomes like a string. A string that has many advantages. For one, it is flexible, you can bend it, and the other is that superglue sticks really good to it. So I cut a few of those strings and used them to make the webs. Why am I doing this to myself? Anyways, before I made the web, I first cut out the back spider and glued it onto the back. Just like with the webs, it is also made out of paper, and yeah, not much to say here. With that glued in place, it was now time to make the webs. There are two types of webs that are running on the suit. The first one is the vertical kind that just wraps around the body, simple as that, and the others are the horizontal ones that have a slight bow. So to make it easy for myself, I first started with the vertical webs and then continued with the horizontal ones. There's not much to say here, so I'm gonna talk a bit about the figure itself. I've already said it quite a few times in this video, but I didn't really have much time to make this figure. I started 2.5 weeks before the movie released, so I really had to hurry up, because at the same time I had to study for 3 exams. Anyways, I know the movie has been out for like a week now, but I'm still proud of myself as to how it's turning out. Especially for that short amount of time. As well as the fact that I did manage to make webs out of paper. Why though? Like, it would have been so much easier to draw them. Anyways, as you can see, I first had to draw them on the figure itself because, well, I had to kind of figure out where the webs would run. And it's much easier to just straight up glue them on instead of figuring out how the webs run on the suit while you are gluing them on. Now this process might look fun and fast, but due to the super glue I somewhat destroyed the fingertips. Totally worth it, no regrets. Now the webs still kind of looked a bit too thick in my opinion. The wideness cannot be changed, but the thickness, so what I did was just sand the entire thing a bit down. This also helped smoothing the webs out, although I had to be careful to not break them apart. And let me tell you, this was the right decision, because that way it was much easier to draw the webs, and overall it looks cleaner. After having finished sanding them down, I removed a few webs from the middle area of the chest and glued on the spider. Just like with the back spider, I cut out the individual pieces and then just glued them on with super glue. Simple as that. Now there are two small details that are still missing on this figure. The first thing are the shoe soles, which I just made by adding a thin clay strip onto the bottom of the foot and then using the piece of cloth that I used in the beginning of the video again to give it a texture. The other detail are the web shooters. To make those, I glued a rectangular piece of clay onto the forearm of the figure and pressed in 2 lines vertically as well as horizontally. The horizontal line is supposed to represent the web cartridges, which it's too small to add proper detailing, so it's good enough. And to finish the web shooter off, I added a thin piece of wire onto the vertical line of the web shooter. Before we head over to the painting process, I still wanted to make the webs. To make those, I used a thin wire and added some more wires on top of it to mimic the shape of the web. The one I'm working on here is the one that's gonna be released from the web shooting gesture hand. To recreate the famous spaghetti webs, I wrapped some sewing string around the wire with superglue. Now there were still some vertical webs missing in between the wires, which I mimicked by using some Uhu Alleskleber. This glue is really fun because it strings, and that's the exact thing that I need to recreate realistic webs. And with that, the figure is finally done. So let's move on to the painting. As always, I'm first gonna start by covering the entire base with some black acrylic wash. Since the clay is already grey, I don't really need to add much paint because that way it looks more like concrete. I also painted the wooden areas black because that way it's much easier to paint the silver later, to make them appear more like metal. The steel beams still look a bit plain to me, so I added some dents using a Dremel as well as scratches using an X-Acto knife. Using a structure paste, I also gave them a bit of a rusty look. After having primed it black, I used a metallic paint which I mixed with brown and painted them. To paint the concrete walls, I used a reddish color. And added some highlights using some light brown and black washes. I used some more watered down black for the gaps in between the bricks, to really make them pop out. To contrast that brick wall to the darker floor, I used watered down white acrylic paint and painted over these sections. To add some more color to the base, I also painted this area brown to kinda mimic dirt. First I covered it with a dark brown, which I then added a lighter brown on top to give a bit of a color contrast. The inside of the brick walls were then painted a beige color to make it appear as if it was the inside of a house. I also used black acrylic wash again to dirty the wall up. Following that up, I painted the black steel beams silver to make them appear more metallic. Once that was set, I then had to paint Scorpion's tail. Just like with the steel beams, I sprayed the entire thing using a black primer. I painted the wires silver and then added a tactical green to the armored pieces of Scorpion's tail. This is the only part in the video where I don't talk much at all, which... bear with me. The video is long, take a break, drink some water, whatever. I painted the hinges silver as well, and since it's pretty simple to paint that, but it still looked a bit too plain, I added some more watered down black acrylic paint to dirty it up a bit. Now this tail has already seen battle, so I'm dry brushing a bit of silver to mark the scratches of the armor. Setting that aside again, it was now time to paint Spider-Man. Pretty simple, since it's just two colors, one is red, the other one is blue. The white primer I used really helps make the colors pop out more than they usually would, so I always recommend using one. Acrylics stick great to polymer clays, but having a neutral background really helps the paint job. Also, thin your paints, I really should have done that for the red. Doesn't matter. The spider was a bit of a challenge because I had to really be careful to not paint the spider blue. Now while I'm painting the blue, I'm taking the time to talk a bit about the color itself. You see, the color you're seeing here is not the one that you're gonna see at the end. Now first I painted it with a royal blue, however I wasn't quite satisfied with the result, and on the reference pictures that I had it looked a bit lighter, so naturally I followed that up by covering a few of the spots with some lighter blue, which didn't fit as well because it kind of appeared like the final swingsuit at the end of Spider-Man No Way Home. You're gonna see that color while I'm painting the black webs. And yeah, I wasn't satisfied with that either, so I did manage to save it by using another shade of blue, which looks so much better at the end. However, I didn't record that process because, well, kind of unnecessary, since you can basically see the exact same thing while you're looking at the screen right now. Following that up, once the red and blue areas were complete, I went ahead and painted the webs black. This was just as tedious as gluing the webs on, so I'm gonna just show you a time lapse of the entire thing. Also, don't forget to paint the spider. As you've heard in the middle of the video, while I was sculpting them, I did intend for them to look a bit more accurate to the movie, which meant that I really wanted them to be kind of as thin as a hair. However, that didn't really turn out that way. It still looks great. Spider-Man's webs are most often than not black, so there isn't a whole lot that you can do wrong. I am very glad that I did sand them down a bit, and I am really satisfied with the end result because it does look cool. However, if I were to do this exact figure again, I might have to figure out a different way to make the webs. And overall, this is definitely nitpicking, because like I said, it looks great. It's just that the other part of me wanted a real challenge. I mean, that's basically the figure that started my entire art career, so I just had to do something special. And I do think that I did manage to make something special. I mean, who would be insane enough to make webs out of paper, right? Another thing that I was a bit worried about while sculpting these webs was that the superglue would leave some residue. Now, I might have mostly destroyed my fingers, but luckily there wasn't much residue that was left. So that's another good point for me. Another thing that I did off camera was add some matte spray varnish on top of the entire figure so that it would look more evenly shiny. And since the webs do have a bit more of a shine, I went over every web as well as the Spider-Man logo using an acrylic varnish, which I watered down a bit. And of course, I also painted the shoe soles, which just like the webs, have the exact same color. Once the webs are done, the obvious thing is to paint the eyes, which... I forgot to record that. Fuck. Nah, whatever. The only thing that I still had to do was add an outline to the red spider on the back, and with that, the black sections of the Spider-Man figure are done. The only thing that I still had to paint now were the web shooters, which was pretty simple, since they're just silver. Now before assembling the figure, I still had to paint the webs. The one that I've already shown you is just straight up white, so nothing special there, but I still wanted to add another one. So basically I did the exact same thing I did for the smaller web, just on a larger scale, and then glued it onto the base. However, before I could glue it in place, I had to make sure that every other part fits perfectly. This also helps estimating where the web should go. Like I said, I wanted Spider-Man to appear to be swinging, so that's what I did. I glued the web onto the pillar and added some more webs in between the wires. I gotta say, this is probably the most satisfying part of the entire sculpture, besides the three-dimensional webs. Once that was dried, I just had to paint it and assemble the entire thing. So yeah. Now the web might be glued, but I still needed to add Spider-Man. Onto the web shooting hand gesture, I glued the smaller web, and naturally onto the closed hand, I glued the big web. I'm a big fan of when Spider-Man wraps the web around his hand, so I added some more pieces of web. And as you can see, I made a large piece of spaghetti web, which I then bent into the appropriate position. And with that, this Spider-Man figure is finally done! I am really proud as to how this turned out, especially for the fact that I had to kind of speedrun it within 2.5 weeks. Personally, I don't think I would have done it any differently. Sure, I could have maybe added a few more details onto Scorpion's tail, but let's be honest, at that scale it wouldn't have really mattered. I am a detailed obsessed freak, but at the other hand I'm also lazy as shit, just like mathematicians. Now I apologize that this year I haven't uploaded many videos. On the other hand, I might have produced the best figures of my entire life. So in a way, it's a good trade-off. At the time this video is out, I've already seen Spider-Man Brand New Day, and I gotta say, it's a good movie, although they showed way too fucking much in the trailers. Seriously, what's the thought process behind that? Because what the fuck, dude? Anyways, I think I can say that I've made my childhood self really proud with this figure. The favorite parts are, like I said, the webs, as well as the webs. And I'm really surprised that the idea I had really turned out that good. Kinda expected it to be worse, especially with that goofy-ass pillar in the middle. Anyways, this movie has kind of convinced me that I really do need to make a Hulk. I mean, that design rocks. Before that, I do need to finish my Q-Fray from Witch Head Atelier though, just as I promised. And I also kinda wanna make a new Bleach figure, because, let's be honest, this one doesn't really look that good. And there's one of Ichigo's forms that I have been looking forward to for a long time. So if you're interested in seeing the things that I'm gonna do the next couple of weeks, follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and of course, follow this channel, subscribe, comment down below, you know the drill. And yeah, I really hope you did enjoy this video. See you guys next time, and
Eat your green vegetables.
bye bye!